Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm going to introduce myself. I feel like it's one of those things where it's a little bit easier if I just introduce myself. My name is Michael Trigilio. I'm a professor here in the Department of Visual Arts. And I think we have images. Yeah. Yeah, look at that. So I want to talk, thank you all for coming to this. I want to talk a little bit about the work that I have on exhibit here at the gallery at Cal IT2, and I'm going to play you a short film that's running in the gallery, but I wanted to play it as a single channel film, and here it's 12 minutes long, so hopefully it's not too long, but I think it'll do many reasons I want to show it to you, because I kind of want to see it on this giant screen. It's kind of an amazing screen, and hear it on these speakers. But I wanted to share it with you because it's a different experience to experience it all together in one group, I think, than the kind of installation view with smatterings of guests. The work in A Glimmer Exodus Sketchbook started about a couple of years ago. It has turned into a body of writing that I've been doing for the last year. You can pick up, we'll have copies for those here today for free at the gallery. This is a chapbook of excerpt chapters of this novel I'm writing called Glimmer, verse 1 of the Blockchain Elegy. And it's a speculative fiction, science fiction novel about these interests of mine that have emerged and have really retained some focus over the last couple of years. About 2016 or so, I started building this set. I started building this like spaceship over at Mandeville, where the visual arts offices are. And it was a massive failure. Only for one reason, which was I didn't really have a very good reason to be building a spaceship. I just wanted to build a spaceship, and I wasn't quite sure why. And it's kind of an expensive decision to make, to build a spaceship and not know why you're building one. And part of what I learned in doing that is my interests in sort of following through with an idea, being curious about an idea, and just pushing and pushing and pushing, kind of being relentless with projects and tinkering and playing with the creative process sometimes results in failure. And I'm really interested in failure. Actually, I'm much more interested in failure than I am in innovation. I think experimentation and trying things out, and maybe they work and maybe they don't, is a much more interesting place to reside as an artist, maybe as a person, than having a kind of goal that you expect of yourself every time. This is a picture of failure. Even my posture looks defeated. But I learned so much from doing this. I learned so much from the way I might approach light and lenses and contrast, and the way I might think about how to develop a set of images. And I tore down that set and I put it in storage around the time of the 2016 election. And in early 2017, I was teaching my science fiction class in the visual arts department. And there was a lot of, in the previous few years, from 2014, with the Michael Brown case forward, there was just a kind of a constant state of rage and feelings of powerlessness and feelings of frustration about how do we inhabit this municipality, this nation, this planet, when there's this sort of sense of wrong kind of around us at all times. I made this short animation, which is also on display in the gallery, called 12 Transmissions from the Occupied States Orbiting the Sun. And it was a way for me to sort of work through a couple of ideas at once, which is how am I processing my anger, my rage, my sense of powerlessness with regards to social justice, political rage, personal feelings of sort of the inability to do as much as I want to be able to do to make change. And so that was one of the things I was making the work about. And I was also interested in science fiction and learning a bunch of new technologies that I'd never touched before. I'd been using certain technologies, certain After Effects and Photoshop and sort of Adobe software, but I began using other kinds of software and just sort of teaching myself with YouTube and teaching myself with tutorials online, going to blogs, like I tell my students to do, you know. And I learned all this software and I began developing this project, and that was the project. That film is screened in London and San Francisco and New York and Portland, and had a nice little life. And I wanted to include it in the show because it connects to many of the themes of the work. Another inspiration for Glimmer and A Glimmer Exodus Sketchbook was this novel by Samuel R. Delany, The Star Pit. Samuel Delany is one of my favorite science fiction authors. He's a really a beautiful writer of prose and a deep thinker about how stories of the future and stories of alterity, stories of space and interdimensionality can reflect what we're actually going through in our lives, and in ways that are not really reductive, but in ways that are actually radical. And the way that he forces his reader to think about race and gender and sexuality, and not even the terms that we use to discuss those ideas and those identities, but in ways that are so much more radical and intergalactic than I had expected when I first picked up my first book by Samuel Delany. And The Star Pit was one of those. It's a short novel. It's like a novella. And it's about a group of a kind of person on this planet called the Golden. And the Golden have this ability to travel through intergalactic space, but only the Golden can. And there's a kind of tension that evolves on this planet between those who are golden and those who are not. And the kinds of access to intergalactic travel that the Golden have creates a whole culture, a kind of counterculture around the Golden and around the non-Golden alike. And that was something that really inspired the work I was doing. And I was also following up on this research of doing the work of what are ways to revolt, to resist, to reject a lot of the status quo, the institutions and the histories that we all consume all of the time. This is John Brown, famous for the raid on Harper's Ferry. And John Brown is a very heavily and well-researched historical figure, anti-slavery abolitionist, and a radical activist, a radical activist who believed in putting his own life in danger in the service of a value or a belief or a faith or a vow. And to me, though I'm not, I don't know how to fire a weapon. I don't even know how to throw a punch, to be honest with you. I've never been in a fist fight. I mean, I got hit once when I was like in 7th grade. That was awful. That was the end for me. So I don't know that John Brown's tactics are my tactics, but in researching John Brown, it's finding ways to thread the ribbon through history and through my values and also the work, so that the work is in many ways about a kind of resistance that is not talk. It's not speech. It's a resistance of action. And much of this work on display and in the gallery journeys in that direction. In the book, The Glimmer, and in the show, it's more alluded to in the show, but I think it'll become clearer when you look at the 12-minute short film tonight. I'm really interested in this idea of liberation theology. I was ordained as a Buddhist priest in 1997, and I resigned in 2002. The relationship between the taking of a vow, the idea of a vow that is bigger and broader than a municipal vow or a marriage vow or a vow in friendship or parenthood, but a vow to something beyond one's own immediate family boundary. It's something that I find really interesting. It's something that I did. I took a vow. There were 14 of them, and I took all 14. This is an image on the left of Daniel Berrigan and Philip Berrigan, two Catholic priests who have been lifelong inspirations to me. In the center is Sister Chun Kum, who is a senior nun in my religious order. And on the right is Prince. And they're not, in the way that I'm thinking of the Glimmer and the way that the Glimmer represented in my show, this notion of transcendence, it can be found through action, a kind of action taken that is grounded in spirituality or grounded in faith or grounded in belief. And one of the things that I have been doing in making this work is thinking about how the image of a kind of creative genius, a kind of the aesthetics, the author, the choreographer, the poet, can inhabit a kind of relationship to transcendence that to me is not so far from the relationship to transcendence that Philip and Daniel Berrigan or Sister Chun Kum investigate. Whether it's a spiritual transcendence is not really something I don't study theology, so I don't know. But certainly a form of transcendence is interesting to me. And transcendence in the name of resistance or revolution or rebellion or action against injustice. This is also Prince. You can tell there's a theme coming. One of the ways that I've navigated this idea of resistance and the way I teach this form of resistance, that my students who may be here, don't call it this in the classroom, so don't tell anybody, is the idea that DIY culture, do-it-yourself culture, that you don't need to seek permission to make the things you want to make, and you don't need to ask permission to do the kinds of work that you want to do, and whether your family or your faculty or your community thinks it's the greatest thing since sliced bread or thinks you're nuts is neither here nor there. The goal is to sort of find this avenue towards transcendence. And I've always been very inspired by Prince. And one of the things that really drove me about Prince when I was very young was that he sort of did it all, right? And that's sort of the mythology of Prince, is that he plays every instrument and he produces his own records and he kind of invents a mythology around himself. And even when that mythology is kind of obnoxious or weird or obtuse or pretentious, it's self-generated and not at the behest of an outside force. And this is not a DIY artist per se. I mean, he had a big record contract, right? But the idea of DIY, of punk rock and hip hop, the idea that we might make a thing because we need to make the thing, and we may need to use intellectual property, or we may need to shoot in this building or in that location, or we may need to make it about a subject that is hot and not easy. Is not something that we need to wait around to do. Permission is an illusion. Control is an illusion. And these images between the sacerdotal images of the priests and nuns and rock idols and DIY, I found a real a site to explore in this work. Over the last few summers, I've been teaching a class on cyberpunk, and a lot of that material is about the dehumanization of the body by becoming android or by becoming an artificial body through Blade Runner, Ex Machina, movies that are science fiction films. And one of the ways that we also look at it, the dehumanization of the body, is when certainty and innovation and technology become dehumanizing to law enforcement and to the body of the police state, to the body of the security apparatus. That there's a way in which not only does it dehumanize the wearer of the costume. This is an image from RoboCop giving him his prime directives. He does not choose his prime directives. They are encoded into his software, into his body, into his musculature and his skeleton. There's a toxicity to the certainty of technology in enforcement tech. And when we think about that certainty, we think about the kind of these images we see so often in science fiction films of the target scope that can differentiate between an innocent person and a guilty person, between a terrorist and a civilian. And that certainty is seductive to us. We want that certainty to exist. We want there to be this technology, this magic, really, this science fiction that would allow a target scope to see an innocent person and a guilty person without having to bring the heart or the soul or the mind to bear on the action of the enforcement individual. And so this project, Glimmer, is sort of playing with all of this material, the idea of enforcement tech and certainty as a kind of toxic bug, and the idea of the song or the poem or the creative impulse as a kind of balm for the wounds that may come from such toxicity. I wanted, on recommendation of Trish Stone, who runs the gallery here, was to talk a little bit about how I made the work, because it is connected to this DIY ethos. I cannot draw. I'm not a drawer. I don't know how to draw. I'm ashamed of it. I was telling my students today I'm ashamed of it. I don't understand perspective. I try to do it, and everything looks like a psychotic person has made a drawing. Like it looks like a ransom note, every drawing I make. And so I can't draw, but I learned to use, but I can do other stuff, so don't get upset. But I learned to use this sort of app, a pen thing with the iPad. to sort of begin doing very, very simple 3D modeling in an app called Shaper 3D, which allows you to kind of draw simple shapes, extrude shapes, combine shapes. And it was like electricity. I suddenly understood certain design approaches that I never really could on the flat page, because it was a three-dimensional environment and because it was gestural and pen-based. I connected to it, and so I began designing these things, and I didn't know what they were, and I kept telling myself not to judge them. Be easy on yourself. You don't know what this is. You failed on the giant spaceship. What are you doing? Just keep drawing, keep trying to make these models. And I began making these designs in Shaper 3D, and I learned through self-study, through reading blogs and going to YouTube and just practicing and practicing and practicing, like I did when I started playing piano when I was 10 years old, to transform these DIY animations, these DIY sculptures, into something that was closer to photorealistic, that was modeled, textured, that was lit. And all of those things I learned on the failure suddenly showed up in this digital environment. The way lenses and light and texture and refraction and reflection were showing up in the digital environment. I wouldn't have had a kind of a doorway into how to make this work had I not had this massive failure. So these are some of the images before and after, and you'll see some of these after images in the short film I'll be screening in just a few seconds. Part of this exhibition also includes these as 3D models. So I think there's this one is included as a 3D model. We had printed the Fab Lab here. Justin Berger, the hero of Cal IT2. Well, there are many heroes of Cal IT2. Many of them are here. But Justin Berger is among them, and helped me print these as a 3D print. So there's two of those that I've been printing. I've been a composer since I was 12, and that's an insane thing to say, and I know it sounds awful when I say it, but it's true. And for this piece of film, I really wanted there to be this anachronistic feel. I write so many electronic scores. I do so much synthesizer, modular synthesizer, drum programming kind of music, but I really wanted to dip into this practice that I learned on when I was in my teenage years. I was writing a lot of string quartets when I was in high school, and I was really invested in string quartet music, and it's kind of old-fashioned now, and it's not something that I think is really hip, but I really wanted these images, these sci-fi, futuristic, imaginative, speculative images to be accompanied by a score that was more kind of pastoral and had a sense of old to it, rather than of its era, rather than a kind of futuristic sound. I didn't want it to sound like Evangelist, a Blade Runner. I wanted it to have an old sound. And so this is an image from the quartet. And then there are the prints. The prints are drawings that I made from beginning with tracings and then making sketches around them, and again doing a lot of what I've been talking about, learning and practicing like I would with an instrument, like I would with a camera, and like I would with a piece of software. And then the text below them comes from a few different places. Jane Elliott, who's a kind of famous educator who has done a lot of anti-racism work. William Kunstler, who's an attorney who became very famous in the 1960s, representing members of the various resistance movements and civil rights movements. And then an article about policing from redpepper.uk, and these quotes kind of get to the heart of the prologue, sort of what lies underneath these beautiful images, these sci-fi images, these intergalactic images. I was telling Trish earlier, this is the first project I've made that doesn't have jokes in it. Like most of my work for my entire career has had jokes in it. I've written jokes. There's no jokes in this work, and that's uncomfortable for me. It's unusual, and it's new. And so part of the work is finding a way to invest in the work. These prints connect to a set of values and a set of ideas around transformation and resistance and revolt and rejecting permission as an option that are much deeper values to me than a good punchline. And so the Jane Elliott quote, "When the pain is over and we're all back together and we're all one again, we find out how society could be if we really believed all this stuff that we preach. If we really acted that way, we could feel as good about one another as those kids feel about one another." So let me play you the film, and then we can do question and answer.
kind of distortion of the mind, what disease of the heart must consume a person to strike down a good man, a kind man? How does a person, much less an officer of the state, become so confident, so certain that the kind man kneeling before him is a mortal enemy? How does a second op know, deep in his bones, that this kind man is a threat, a danger, a monster? Our friend was never a monster. But to these second ops, he had to have been. He was transformed, altered, the technology of history and conditioning and thousands of years of indoctrination allowing him to become transformed. Not in reality, but in the eyes, and through the target scope, of the second op called to some random restaurant on some ordinary night. This is not a revelation. I am not speaking to a group who has not gone through such a transformation themselves. Don't we all have the experience of mutation, of being altered, whenever we walk into a place where the causes and conditions are sufficient to allow them to see us as monstrous? As criminal? As sick? And I am not speaking of the glimmer. Of course, that's the wrinkle in our specific little blip of chronology that transforms my voice into one of considerable volume and reach. But I am not other merely because I am glimmer. None of us are. We are other when we are distorted through the cracked lenses of a global culture that sees many of us, so many of us, as monstrous. To be honest with all of you, frankly, I'm done. I am fucking done. I really thought that the chosen we encode into our work would allow us Glimmer to provide some balm, some healing, some respite to our fellow travelers, to perform as one node among so many others to aid in the revolution of connection. The losses from the stat collapse weigh on every human being, the blood stains soaked deep into our land and our bodies. Here I am celebrated as Glimmer, as a great maestro, and still I am transformed, still distorted, still made monstrous by a culture that can look at me and find a creature. A monster. We have been saying this for years. We told you to stop. We told you it was killing us all, this manic, obsessed race towards innovation and achievement at the expense of growth and connection and love and joy and friendship. Whenever we see a glimmer, we always stroke a line down from our eye past our cheek. I've done this countless times, and have been greeted this way for most of my adult life. Cheers. When the glimmer began our contact with the neural extuma, we realized the potential we had to unlock what the scientists call sonic empathic notation. We open our hearts, and we open the hearts of those around us. And when our hearts are open, like they are today, we weep. We weep with grief and loss, but we also weep with love and ecstasy and wonder. And sometimes we weep with rage. The chosen we share is not grounded in the toxic myth of certainty or the gratification of authority. Our sacrament is a hard connection, and it brings tears to our eyes. Let me be clear to my fellow Glimmer. Let us show them why we cry. Let's make the teardrop the most plentiful commodity on the planet. I am not willing to go on thriving and performing and ministering chosen in the face of toxic certainty and xenophobic, chauvinist, structural white power. Glimmer who are here with me today, here in this room, who are streaming this eulogy, let us pray. And let us not go back to our patterns of comfort and self-satisfaction. Let's begin the first verse of a new sacrament. Our Exodus mantra.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, seems like a good a time as any to have questions. Before questions, just because it gets a little crazy, I do want to thank Cal IT2 and the gallery at Cal IT2 and Trish Stone for all of the support. If this show wouldn't have been happened, if she had suggested to me to start putting this work and whipping it into some kind of shape, and I appreciate it very much. And the committee of the gallery at Cal IT2 who have been very supportive. Ruben, who's been amazing on the AV and really helpful. And like I mentioned earlier, Justin Berger, who helped me make those prints. We have Cafe Calabria. That's my favorite cafe. It's the only place I ever go for coffee. And so I got them to come and do coffee. So during the reception, grab a coffee drink. I don't really drink, but I drink coffee like crazy. So we have espresso drinks there, as well as all the great food that the Cal IT2 provides. So I want to make sure I did that before we got carried away with all the questions that there may be. So we do have microphones. And if you would like to ask a question, that's a better way, just because I think they're recording this and they want to make sure they get it on the recording, whatever your question may be. So please ask. Microphone. Oh, hey, I didn't see who it was. Hi,
Hey,
Alina.
Michael, thanks so much.
Thank
for
you,
that.
Alina.
I just had a question. If
Yeah.
you could talk a little bit about what the planetary means for your work, because so much of it is about like a kind of speculative, so to speak, landscapes. I'm just wondering what makes looking at things in terms of the planetary context and the larger context a fruitful place for you to imagine your work.
Thank you. So thinking about the planetary as, and in many ways, for me, it's like interplanetary, that planets are like, the idea of a planet as a site. We think of this planet as sort of our home because we're humans and we've risen to the top of the food chain, we tell ourselves, and it's our home. It's not our home, right? We're part of it. The outside of my skin is just the inside of the earth. And so there's not really this separation between who I am and what the earth is. And so if we think about the and I'm not a nature person, like I've never been camping, so this is not coming from that place. But truly, I'm freaked out by mosquitoes. But if we think about the planet as not this thing that's outside of me, but that's actually part of me, then the idea of interplanetary becomes really kind of exciting to think about in science fiction, that there may be places and there may be ways to explore other places that where my body is both a foreign object and truly a foreign object, but also brings with it all of Earth along with it. And because for me, this is also a kind of poetic gesture, thinking about making the culture we want, making the planet we want, rather than simply getting by on the planet that we have. The idea of visiting other places and collaborating with other places is exciting. And in the story, it opens up whole other really complicated and unresolved narrative problems, because the language of science fiction is often the language of colonization. And so when you see your body as invading another body, you are retelling the narrative of colonization. And that is less interesting to me. I think it's a toxic script that's been repeated over and over again. And so thinking about planetary as embodiment, but also planetary as the potential for exploration of the mind, of transcendence, rather than of going and living in another place. That's not very interesting to me at all. To think of planetary as a metaphor for embodiment, but not to reduce it to now I have to get on a ship and go to a planet. That I think raises whole other problems that I've yet to resolve, honestly, but I'm working on. I don't see well. If you go to the mic, or if you have it, you can maybe yell it. Question. The mic will pick that up. Yeah. Anybody? Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, you're welcome. This is light. Yeah. Any other questions, concerns, worries? Oh yeah, in the front. Oh yeah, that kind of gets to what the previous person asked, what Professor Williams asked, which is the thing I love most about science fiction movies, and I watch a lot of science fiction movies and shows. I watch probably too many. Oh hey, and so there's a way in which the thing I love most about science fiction movies and shows is the spaceships and the shots of outer space. I wish they had less talking and fewer actors. That's the most boring thing to me. I really like the Star Wars movies, and I did a supercut you can find on Vimeo of the best cut of Return of the Jedi you'll ever see, and it's just the spaceships, and everything else is gone because that's the way I'd rather watch those movies. I'd rather allow myself to sort of project the possibility and the hopefulness and the imagination and the worry and the anxiety and the excitement of being in these places or on these vessels or leaving this place and discovering this other place and encountering new realms of thought and discourse. That's much more interesting to me than a love story or a hero myth. And when love stories and hero myths become the only means by which science fiction can be told, it makes it, I think, much less possible for bigger questions, or frankly, more interesting questions for me. It's not even that they're bigger questions. They're not actually bigger questions, but they're more interesting to me. And so having creatures and pilots and heroes and villains, which they get reduced to very quickly, is less important to me. In the book, there are characters. So I feel like there was a thing that Bradford Young said that really spoke to me last year when he came to speak, the cinematographer, Oscar-nominated cinematographer. And he was talking about filmmaking as a visual medium, and that he talks to so many people who say that they want to tell their story and they're into storytelling. And he says, and I'm not quoting because I don't remember the exact quote, but something like, filmmaking is a visual medium. If you want to tell a story, write a book. If you want to make images, make films. And that, for some reason, that really connected to what I had been working on and been doing and sketching, which is that I wasn't so interested in telling a story visually. I was interested in showing images visually. But I did have a story I wanted to tell, so I wrote a book, right? And so I sort of just took his advice kind of literally. Now that I think about it, I should write him a note. Thanks to Bradford Young also for his insight. He didn't even know he was giving me advice. But that kind of gets to the lack of characters in the visual plane and the sonic plane. And yet we do hear a voice. And the voice is a character from the book, Asada 6, who's a glimmer and who's delivering a eulogy and who's speaking to the need for the characters in the book to use their gifts in the aid of resistance and empathy. Long answer to an easy question. Yes, in the back, I see a hand.
There was one part, I think it was connection or connected, where you did not have any speech in there.
Yeah.
All the other ones did.
Yeah.
What was the thought process behind that?
Can you repeat the question, please?
The question was, there's a little speaker here. It's great. So I'm here from this guy too. No, it's fun. So the question is that during the film I showed, one of the sequence called Connection has no speech, has no voiceover. There's voiceover in the first and the second and the fourth, but not during the third, during the connection. And what was my thought process about that? And it's a good question. When I'm working on these things, I do have a reason I'm going to get to, so I'm not going to cop out, but I'm going to explain how I got there really quickly, which is I'm working through these things, and it's going to sound so pretentious, but like the way like a painter or a composer might work through them. They're not like scripted out and planned and plotted, and they're not sort of everything in its right place. I'm kind of improvising with the material and what feels right. So the first place I got to to get to your question was that it felt right for that section to be open. And then, then the next page challenge is, well, justify it to yourself as a maker. Like, does this work? There's a kind of blue fabric. Is the connection with that? But we get to do a lot of that work rather than being told what it is. And so it gives us some space to make a connection and to be, I don't mean this, it's going to sound corny, but that's, but kind of we get to connect to the thinking around that journey in a way that's less a script being delivered to me about what I'm watching. Whereas in the first, second, and fourth sequences, I liked having the balance of this eulogy, this text from the eulogy being the balance. And that section, I felt like it really worked to let the viewer really have some openness. 2001: A Space Odyssey is a big inspiration, as you might gather now that I've said it, right? That this sort of openness to just connect to certain sequences or certain moments that take their time to unfold without a lot of explanation. And that third act worked that way for me. Thank you. It's a good question. Yes. Robot voice? The Sada 6 is human. One of the ways that the Glimmer function in the novel is sort of they're augmented, and they've sort of they introduce these sort of anybody can introduce these augmentations to their body to sort of integrate their bodies with technology in all kinds of ways. And one of the ways that these characters often do that is to kind of augment with various audio processing and synthesizers and various kinds of augmentations of the sonification of their bodies, whether it's the vocal cords or the head or their hands and arms and the gestures of control around voice and singing and music. And so as I was sort of working through this idea, I had this thought that I wanted it to be a kind of a computer voice that was kind of slightly gendered towards a Sada 6, who's gendered cis female, but I didn't want it to be rendered so literal, so one-to-one, like this is an actress reading a script. I wanted it to have this affectation of the distance, the coldness, the coolness you get from that synthetic voice. And honestly, I don't know if it's successful or not, right? That's part of the process is as I watch it, and sometimes I really love that choice, and other times I'm curious about it and whether or not working with a voice actress and getting a performance that's directed might get me a different solution. Right now, I'm happy with it, but I think it's a really good question, and it's a good way to think through to these relationships. Thank you. Oh, hey, Amy.
I'm curious about the point of view, because you're calling it a sketchbook, and so that for me that implies that there's a sketcher.
Yeah.
And also just in terms of where, and I haven't read the novel, so I don't know if there is a body attached to the idea of the sketches.
Mm-hmm.
And also just in general in terms of the scenes themselves, like where is the point of view? Is there an entity
Yeah.
not seeing?
Right. So the question is about point of view, and what's the point of view of the maker of the sketchbook, and what's the point of view of the camera in the shots? Is it a point of view of a person, or is it meant to be like omniscient? How does it function? The sketches are my sketches. So the point of view of the sketchbook is this is my sketchbook. And the goal, I wrote about this a little bit in the poster text, and I only refer to it because I think I wrote it better than I could say it right now. But it's something along the lines of, I like the way a sketchbook and just talking about a body of work that you've been working on, rather than like a magnum opus or the grand gesture. There's a way in which it's diminutive, and it speaks to it being kind of anyone can do it. That I just did it, and it wasn't this big precious thing. I just whipped these up over a year, and that to me connects to what the story is about and what these themes are about. That we can just do these things. We can just whip up these sketches and then polish them and get them into some shape, and the sketchbook becomes a kind of site for a kind of aesthetic resistance, and not an overly processed and kind of grinding the work down over 5 or 6 years into a perfect crystal. Maybe it could use that, but that's not what the goal here is. This other thing, and that's where the sketchbook becomes a kind of container for the work. I'm proud of the work. I think the work is polished. Some of the works are very polished. The 3D models need some work, guys, with the paint job. But in general, I'm pretty proud of the work. I am very proud of the work. But you can see I'm trying to convince myself because it's brand new. I just finished it, everybody. And but in that way, it's a sketchbook. It's something I made. It wasn't funded by a big company. I didn't work at a production company. There's no investors. You know what I mean? Like the biggest investor is Cal IT2. Thank you very much, Cal IT2. But there isn't like, I'm not accountable in this way to a group of financial or industrial partners that would require it to be something that it isn't. And it allows a liberty and a freedom to explore the ideas that I want to explore kind of as I want to explore them. And so the sketchbook becomes a container for that. For the shots, the point of view in the shots is meant to be well, it's meant to be read almost entirely as neutral. That it could be it's almost like a survey of these places and these vessels and these sites and these journeys without any subjectivity. And that, again, like I was saying to another this young woman here who was asking the question about Asada Six's voice, it's an open question about being clearer about that for myself, because it's something I hadn't overly prescribed to myself. I had sort of thought these cameras are sort of just floating, like the neutrality of an omniscient camera. I hope that's not a dissatisfying answer, because they're long, like they're long answers. So that at the end of it, you're like, oh, kind of ended on a whimper, and that's not good. Okay, maybe one more question before we all get to have coffee and eat. Oh, I don't see hand, but please, yes.
You have a bunch of ships and probes, and they're sort of blockish and simple shapes rather than sleek aerodynamic design. So I was wondering, what was your inspiration behind them?
The design of the ships. The design of the ships was, in many ways, I was looking at a lot of sort of concept art. I'm really inspired by a lot of the work by obviously Chris Foss and Mobius, and thinking about shapes and designs that are not bound to the physics of aerodynamics the way that we kind of expect spaceships to be designed when we watch Battlestar Galactica and Star Wars. That though I don't know if that's true for Star Wars, but that we kind of expect curves and sleek edges and fins and a kind of vehicle-like design. And I was interested in ways of, in some ways, many of the vessels look like animals. Like there's a red ship that kind of looks like a rabbit's head. There's another ship that looks kind of like a dog. I wanted to kind of suggest something really alien and something not that was both familiar, like I see it, it's a ship, it's not a flower. But it's also doesn't make sense for here. It doesn't make sense given the literature of science fiction that is most familiar to me, because it's blocky, because it's clunky, because there's so much asymmetry in the design. One of the ships has a long kind of curved plank with two giant wheels, and then this asymmetrical like teardrop plunging, object, and it doesn't make any sense in terms of its design practically. But I was interested in it as a design that would force you to think that it could provoke a kind of, this is not something that was made here. This was not made on the planet. It would take a feat of engineering to build this in gravity that may not be possible. And so it requires us to think, well, this looks to me as if it were alien, or this looks like to me as if it's so far in the future as to be incomprehensible. And that was what the direction I was bending in. You see engines and stuff, right? So there are these sort of familiarity cues that I was interested in, like that we see engines and that it isn't like water propulsion in space, or a propulsion of rage and love made visible or something. I still wanted to be familiar enough that you see fire, but I think that the goal was to get to something both familiar and unfamiliar as much as possible. And I'm still designing, so they may get crazier or they may get more boring. You can't know. That's the whole thing. They're sketches. Thank you, everyone, for coming out. I appreciate it. The weather's terrible, and you all made the journey, and I appreciate it. Please go have some delicious coffee and some treats and foods, and enjoy the show. Thank you for coming out.